Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Atelier Artworks online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c) not-for-profit organization. We're currently in our Winter 2 session, which ends next week, and the Spring 1 session begins on March 7th. We offer a variety of fine art drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We also offer classes in illustration and digital painting. Details can be found on our website, theatelierflowerfield.org. Our next exhibition is Middle and High School Student Artist Juried Show, which runs from March 10th to April 10th, and the opening reception will be on March 12th. Tonight's lecture demo is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management, and it is titled Spring Tulips and is being given by our instructor, Elizabeth Fusco. We welcome her this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's demonstration. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room, and I shall now hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I hope everybody's excited that spring is kind of around the corner, even though we're getting a snowstorm tonight. But before you know it, we'll be seeing tulips and daffodils and all the other spring bulbs. I do have a few slides that I'm going to share right now and talk a little bit about tulips. Alrighty, so here is a variety of beautiful tulips that we will hopefully be seeing very soon. They come in a variety of colors and different species. So here's a few species. This is a parrot tulip, which I think are really beautiful. And you can tell they're parrot tulips because of the ruffly edges, and they're usually a combination of colors. This one speaks for itself, a fringe tulip. You can see that little fringy edge on the petals. And it's also a double. You can see that there's more than 6 petals on this tulip, so it's a really full tulip. And then we have the lily tulip, which kind of does look like a lily. So they do belong to the lily family. They originated in Southern Europe and Asia. And even though the Dutch kind of cornered the market on tulips, they do cultivate the most variety of tulips, but it's not even their national flower. It's the national flower of Afghanistan and Hungary and Turkey. But they do have the most beautiful tulip gardens. I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Netherlands. Supposed to be going there in April to the Tulip Festival, but we shall see what we will. Here is one of the gardens, the Kukenhof Gardens of the Netherlands. They actually have over 7 million tulip bulbs. So really beautiful. They're such beautiful flowers, although they're very ephemeral. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But most people know the parts of the tulip, the basic parts. But when you're a botanical illustrator, you really have to dissect and understand the biology of the tulip. But most people know that it comes from a bulb. And when you start to see that little green stem coming up, you know that the tulip is about to bloom. They don't usually last very long, which is quite challenging when you're trying to paint a tulip. But you know, we have the basic parts is the petal and the stamen and the anthers where the pollen is, the filament. And sometimes the tulips are so closed up that you don't even see those parts, which is the case with the tulips that I have tonight. So these are some tulips that were painted many, many years ago. The one on the left is by Ferdinand Bauer, and he was a botanical illustrator. And the one on the right is by Redouté, another very famous botanical artist. You could see the difference in the colors. The Bauer tulip is quite green and very, the leaves are very green. And the one on the right is a little more muted color. These are, well, this is one of the tulips that I painted, and next to an Alstroemeria that I painted, but I just wanted to show a little bit of some of my paintings. The tulips, the yellow ones, those are parrot tulips. You can see that they're very roughly edged. And these are just some other of my paintings. The left is a hibiscus flower, and the one on the right is an anemone. So the flower that I picked that we're going to look at tonight and that I'm going to demonstrate is a Dutch tulip. I couldn't find the actual name for it, but the photograph on the left is what I found to compare it to, and the photo on the right is of the actual tulip that we will be looking at, and I will be demonstrating how to paint it. So I've got my camera going. So the first thing I wanted to show is the tulip. So I'm going to take it out of the water for a second. And so it's really, I think, so pretty. Very, very pink. I'm hoping that you can get a good idea of the color. There's it's variegated, so there's a lot of green coming out from the stem. It's a really vibrant, very lemony green. I don't know if you can see that. And the petals are very, very bright pink. The lighting down here kind of doesn't do it justice, but so I'd like to show a little bit about my setup and how I start and my materials, because that's really important. So feel free to take notes, write down some of the things that I use. First and foremost is my paper. So whenever I teach a botanical class, I really stress the importance of a good paper. And I'll tell people, if you can't afford the expensive brushes or the expensive paint, you really, really will do yourself a favor if you spring for the expensive paper. It is a little costly, but it's 100% cotton. Let me see if you could see that. So 100% cotton. This is 140 pound. You can also get it in 300 pound paper, but this is hot press. And the reason why I use hot press is because it's very smooth. There's no texture really to the paper. Kind of the opposite of cold press, has a little more texture. But the reason why we use hot press is because you want to get a very accurate straight line, and it's easier to get that with the hot press because it's so smooth. The cold press, you'll have your paintbrush going in and out little indentations in the paper. So I always think about hot press. When you think about pressing something or ironing something, you get out all the wrinkles and it's really, really smooth. So that's the paper. As far as brushes are concerned, I use mostly Winsor Newton. This is a number 4. They are series 7. They're very fine sable, Kolinsky sable brushes. That's a number 4. And this is a number 2. And I usually don't use any bigger than a 4. So you can see how tiny they are. A lot of times I'm also working with a number 2 mini. It's just has a shorter stack of of hairs. So you can see how short the hairs are on the number 2 mini. Same size width as the number 2, just a smaller amount of hair. And then of course we've got the number 1, which is even, that's not number 1, sorry. Where's my number 1? Here we go. This is, oh, actually this is a 0. So some of the brushes are very tiny, and working with a tiny brush, I have to use my reader glasses because there's the strokes are so small that I have to really, you know, look close up. Okay, anyway, then because I don't want to mash my brushes, the nice Kolinsky sable brushes around, I use a very inexpensive brush to mix my paint. I got this probably at Michael's, and it's just a synthetic brush. It's a nice sturdy synthetic brush. I've had it for years, but it helps me take my paint and mix it around. So now we'll talk a little bit about some paint. And I use a variety of paints. I have my palette set up for tonight with the colors that I know I'm going to use mostly. So we've got Ultramarine Blue, and as I'm talking, I will show you. This is Ultramarine Blue. This is a Winsor Newton paint, and it comes in a little tube. These tubes are, it feels like they're expensive because they're probably about $8 maybe for a tube, but the tube of watercolor paint lasts for a really long time. Once it's dried on your palette, you don't have to throw it out or get rid of it. It can stay there and you can keep using it. It's not going to go bad. So that's the Ultramarine Blue. Also, before I start, I want to show you my little setup with my 2 cups of water. Very important to have 2 cups going all the time. 1 cup will always stay clean. I always want a cup of clean water. You don't want to be taking your dirty water that you're rinsing your brush off in. So I'm constantly rinsing my brush and drying it on some paper towel, and then coming back to the clean water to pick up the paint, so that my paint always stays clean, and you can see that it's not getting mixed in with the other paint. So this color is lemon yellow. So I'm rinsing off in my rinsing water. And this is also a Winsor Newton paint. Very cool yellow. And I'll talk a little bit about the primary colors in a second. So we do have basically some primaries. We've got the blue, the yellow, and the red. And most people remember from elementary art those primary colors. But even though we have blue, yellow, and red, there are different temperatures of color. So this is a very cool red and a very cool yellow. Oopsie, I just put some opera rose in my yellow. So let's get rid of that. So this beautiful pink, I love this pink. It's so pretty. It's a lot of flowers, believe it or not, have this beautiful opera rose color. This is a color by Schminke. So this is opera rose. Schminke paints are very well-made paints, highly pigmented, beautiful colors. I like them a lot. And here we have, this is May Green, which is a really very vibrant, cool green, and that's also by Schminke. So that's May Green. So a little bit about watercolor paint. It's a pigment just like any other painting medium, oil paint or pastel, watercolor. When you grind a pigment for your paint, the thing that changes is the binder. So if you are using some sort of ultramarine blue and the pigment is ground, if you add that pigment to linseed oil, you'll get oil paint. If you add that same pigment to gum arabic, you'll get watercolor. So that's basically the main ingredients of watercolor paint is pigment and gum arabic. Some companies like Atelier use honey, and M. Graham, I believe, uses honey. The reason why some of these student grade paints are a little cheaper, again, you know, we're talking about spending a little extra money to get the better quality. The student grade paints use pigment and filler and then the binder. So you're not getting pure pigment, and that's why you might not have the same results with your paint if you're using a student grade. Same thing with the brushes, you know, materials. Painting is a kind of expensive hobby, but so is pretty much any hobby. But more so in watercolor than any other medium, I feel that if you're painting with oil, you can pretty much paint on anything. You can paint on wood, on panel. Same with pastel, same with acrylic, but with watercolor, because it's a little less forgiving, you want to have the most easier time with your painting. So the materials definitely make a huge difference. If you're using student grade paper, you're not going to be able to move that paint around. So it does get a little frustrating if you're trying to get away with student grade quality, I'll say. I'm going to take out my tulip again. So, well, actually, let me talk about the drawing part of it first. So flowers are very ephemeral, and especially tulips, they kind of change as you're drawing and painting them. So the drawing that I have are, these are from tulips that I drew last week. So obviously I don't have the same exact tulips, but because I have the drawing, I can now, you know, match the colors that I have of the tulip in front of me. So when I'm doing the drawing part of any kind of a painting, I try and allow myself that time, at least a couple of hours, to sit and draw, because I want to get that drawing done accurately and as quickly as possible, knowing that the flower is not going to last that long. And sometimes you have to go out and buy another flower, because when you're painting in botanical illustration, you're illustrating a live specimen. So you're not painting from a photograph, you're actually painting from life, which is, I like doing that. Painting from a photograph is fine, but you get a lot more out of your subject if you can have it in front of you. The camera doesn't give you all the information that you need, but having the subject in front of you, you'll be able to measure accurately and get your colors accurate. So when I have this specimen in front of me, and right now it's in a vase next to me, and that's kind of how I start off. I have my subject and I begin by measuring. I measure everything very carefully, the size of the petals, the leaves, and I'm doing all this on a piece of tracing paper, like this. And if you look carefully, you can probably see some of my pencil lines. So I'm using a number 2, where's my pencil? I use a number 2H or an H pencil, and here we have an H Faber-Castell. It's a kind of a hard pencil. I don't want to have so much graphite on my paper, on your watercolor paper. You're trying to keep it as clean as possible. So I'm using a number H to draw and sketch. And once I have my drawing pretty much, accurate, and like I said, this is not the drawing of this tulip. This is today's tulip. Last week's tulip is already shriveled up and went to the mulch pile. But the drawing is done on the tracing paper because tracing paper is very inexpensive. I can erase on it. You can see I've erased. I have a bunch of different lines. I know I'm going to make a mistake, so I don't worry about erasing on the tracing paper. If it's really bad, I can throw it in the garbage and start all over again. I don't want to draw right onto my good watercolor paper because if I make a mistake, which I will, then you have to erase. And when you start erasing on your good watercolor paper, you start disturbing the fibers, and you kind of ruining the paper. So you want to do the least amount of erasing on your good watercolor paper. So the tracing paper, I get to do my drawings. I did draw 2 tulips. And then once I draw them, I kind of put them in a composition that I like. And after I do the drawing in pencil, then I go over the drawing with a micron pen. And that's what you see here is the black ink. And then I transfer this to my watercolor paper. So sometimes it takes a good long afternoon of drawing and correcting and getting the actual drawing correct. And then, like I said, this information is the most important. So that's why I take the time to get the drawing right before the flower kind of loses its petals or falls apart or whatever they do. I do take some photographs, but as long as I've got my information of the drawing, and then of course I take some color notes. So I make these little color charts of the colors that I know I'm going to need to mix. So what I do is I take out my paints, I take my flower in front of me, and then I start to match. Again, it's probably not going to be accurate on the camera, but you can see some of these colors. Well, it's much lighter in person. So I try to figure out what colors I'm going to need, what colors I'm going to have to mix, to get the different values, to get the different hues where there's shadow colors, and take notes and write down what I'm going to use. It's really important because, like I said, if I don't have this flower tomorrow, the same exact color, at least I know from photographs and from my little color chart how I can continue. So I've got my drawing, I've got my color chart, I've got my paints and my paintbrushes and my palette. So these are the colors that I'm definitely going to use, but I also have my my other palette. It's a little messy, so forgive me, with all my other colors that in case I need them. I talked a little bit before about warm and cool colors. So I always have ultramarine blue. That's a good standard blue to use. I always have a cool and a warm yellow. The ones I use the most are the lemon yellow, which is in the other palette, and either a cadmium or this is a new gamboge. They're both yellows, but they do different things. The same thing with the reds. I usually have a warm red, which is Scarlet Lake. This is more of like an orangey red, and then Permanent Rose, which is more of a cool red. So once you have those 5 colors, I'll say them again: ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, lemon yellow, Permanent Rose, and Scarlet Lake. Once you have those 5 main colors, that would be considered a limited palette, which a lot of artists mostly use a limited palette because you can mix so many colors with just those 5. Let me see if I have my little chart here of the mixed colors. That's one of the best practices. No, that's not it. Is taking your paints and figuring out. Well, this is a little bit of practice of taking those 5 colors and mixing to see how many different colors you can get with just those 5. And believe it or not, all of these colors come from those 5 colors. And you can keep going. You can make all sorts of neutral colors, so many different kind of greens with just the ultramarine blue and those 2 yellows. So it's not necessary to have all of the colors that I have. I just, like to buy different colored paints. But again, this kind of a green, this May green is a nice green right out of the tube. But if I needed to get a really very cool green similar to that May green, you can always mix with some ultramarine blue. And some lemon yellow. You need a lot more lemon yellow than the blue because the blue is a lot stronger of a color. Let's see if we can get close. Okay, we're getting closer. Okay, it's not exactly that May green, is much more vibrant, but it is a nice, cool, very lemony green. And if you needed to tone down your green a little bit, we'll make a nice, I'm going to actually add some of the warmer yellow, which is the cadmium yellow, because for these tulip leaves, the leaves are actually a little bluer and a little warmer than the stems. So we've got more of a warmer green. And then sometimes if you take a tiny bit of your red, it will desaturate or neutralize the color a little bit so that it's not so saturated and vibrant. And sometimes you need that with leaves because they're not always that bright, vivid green. Okay. So I did start this. I transferred my drawing to my watercolor paper. And now I have the watercolor paper taped down to a board, a foam core board that I buy at Dollar Tree. And I tape it down on all sides so that it's not going to buckle or bubble. I want it nice and flat. So you can see that I've kind of worked on this one a little bit more than this tulip. And if you can see, I usually start with a wet into wet wash, meaning that I will do a little sample here. When you do a wet into wet wash, you're wetting the paper. Let's just draw a circle. You want that first wash to go on very lightly, and I work very lightly. I don't work heavy with the watercolor. My motto is always, you can always get darker, you can't get lighter. And with watercolor, the idea is to go from light to dark, kind of the opposite of most other mediums. With oil paint, you go from dark to light, because you can always add light on top of oil paint. With watercolor, you really can't. So your white is the white of the paper. So if you need to leave a highlight or a lighter area, you have to kind of think about that before you get your pigment covering all over the paper. So here I'm wetting my paper. I'm not sure you can see, but I take a look at it in the light and just make sure that sheen is covering that whole area. And then I will take my paint, and it's mostly water this first wash, with some pigment, but I want it to be really wet so I can really get that move around the whole area in a nice even wash. So I'm kind of working fast. So this is my first wet into wet layer. And I don't have it taped down, so it's bubbling up a little bit, but that's okay. So that's what we mean by wet into wet. You wet the paper and then you're adding the very wet pigment onto your paper. So I did do that with my tulips. Let's see. Okay. So I did another wash of green on this side, but here you can see I did my first wash very lightly. Like I said, we can always go back in and get darker. And on the leaves, I put a wash of yellow because there's always a lot of yellow underneath. And because watercolor is transparent, you want to be able to see those colors underneath. So I'm going to use my number 4 brush to get my next wash of color on my leaves. And I've already figured out the colors that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead with this one here that's coming across the tulip. And this is just another light wash. If anybody has any questions while I'm painting, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I think Gabby will be reading them. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker green. so that I can go to this leaf back here that's behind this one. And because it's behind, I know that it has to be a little bit darker. So I've got another wash, and you really need to have a little bit of patience because you have to wait for one layer to dry before you go back in. And you don't want to go from one section to something right next to it until that one dries, because sometimes they'll bleed together. So now I'm going to go down to this leaf here. And again, I usually have a few different values of green. This is going to be much lighter.
So we do have a question.
Yes.
How do you transfer your drawing to the paper?
Oh, that is a good question. Yes, I skipped that part. So there are quite a few ways to transfer your drawing to your watercolor paper. So I use a light box, and I can actually show you this one. Give me 1 minute. So this one, I bought off Amazon. I believe it was less than $20. I have a very large one on my desk that I can't really get that on camera, but I can show you this one. Okay. So this is a light pad, and you can see that it lights up pretty good. So this is one method of transferring. So you can take then your tracing paper, and if you take a piece of watercolor paper and then put it over, oh, that's not a good piece, hold on. A piece that's not, nope. Okay, let's see. All right, hold on. All right, let's see if this works. Well, this is 300-pound paper, so I don't know how well you can see on camera, but if you see the drawing underneath coming through, then you can lightly trace over on the watercolor paper. I have to have a piece of, well, that's all. All right. Anyway, so that's one method of transferring. So using a light table or a light box. And actually, if you have a nice bright sunny window, you can tape this on your window and put your watercolor paper over it. And the window will actually act as a light box, and you'll be able to see your image underneath the watercolor paper. So if you don't have a good window and you don't have a light pad, you can use graphite paper. I don't like to use it because I feel like it smudges on your watercolor paper. but there is another method of transferring. If you wanted to take your tracing paper and you decided you were drawing a, let's say you wanted to transfer a circle. So I drew the circle on the top of my paper, and now I want to transfer it onto my watercolor paper. So what I will do is take the back of my paper and add some graphite on the back. With a circle, it's not really, it's kind of the same thing on both sides, but if you're drawing a flower or anything, it's going to be different when you turn it over. And you might just want that top side image. So now I've gotten my graphite on the back of my image. And you can take your pencil and carefully, you don't want to press too hard because you don't want to make a groove in your paper. And you don't want a lot of that graphite on your paper either. But if you carefully trace over your image, then you have your image on your watercolor paper. Does that clear anything up for the person who asked? So that's 3 or 4 ways to transfer your drawing. You can either use a window, a light box, graphite, or graphite paper, which again, that would be my least favorite way of transferring. Okay, so back to this really nice May green. I'm going to go to my number 2 brush. And again, I did my first wash on here, so that now I'm going to start with some finer strokes of this green, and you'll see that I'm going very lightly over that green, and then I'm going to go back in, and I work with one petal at a time. So I'm working on this center petal. And again, I usually take my brush and check the value before I go right back into my painting. And I'm doing such very light strokes.
We have another question.
Sure.
Maybe I can use the computer screen to transfer a picture or a drawing instead.
I don't know how you would be able to do that. That's not something that I've ever done, so I can't answer for that. Yeah, I wouldn't know. I want to get a little darker in here because this is where the petal is going behind that other petal. So you need to kind of give it a little bit of a darker value. So that's when I'll add a little bit of ultramarine blue to my opera rose, just to give that bit of And again, I'm going very lightly and building up the colors pretty slowly. Let's see here. And I don't want to forget about the stem. So there's a little bit of the stem peeking out. And for those of you who have seen tulips, you know that the stem runs all the way down into the leaf. Let's see if I can get one of my this out of the way. And the other thing I do is really study the plant before I start drawing it. Sometimes I'll take it apart. I'll practice doing just a petal and maybe just a leaf and do a little study of the whole tulip. But you can see how that stem runs right inside the leaf. This little tulip had 3 leaves all coming out of the stem. Sometimes there's more. But again, the leaf that's behind, I want to show it's behind by making it just a little bit darker. And it's hard to see on camera, but I'm really going very lightly and very softly with my brush. I'm not pressing hard. I'm making very light strokes at the same time, giving some texture to the leaves. It's such a very delicate way of painting. Some people find it a little nerve-wracking to paint this style, but for me, it's very relaxing. And again, I'm building up very slowly, one section at a time. Let's get some. So you can see that there's yellow underneath. And a lot of that will show through because watercolor is so transparent, which is one of the things most people love about watercolor. And we want to keep it transparent. That's why we're working with very light, layers. If you take your paint straight from the tube, which is another thing that I don't usually take my paint straight from the tube because it's very highly pigmented, and this is, you know, it's been out for a while, but if you took it right out of the tube, you can see how rich these colors are. So I usually set them out and then rehydrate them as I need them, because I don't want them to be so strong. I feel like if that's the case, you may as well paint with acrylics. They're not meant to be opaque. They're meant to be very translucent, letting that white of the paper coming through. Okay. So it does take a while to finish a painting. Like I said, you definitely have to have patience to let some of the layers dry before you go back over them, because then sometimes you might be lifting up paint if it's not dry enough. So this leaf is kind of turned. So the part that's turning is going to be much darker underneath. And it takes practice, just like anything else. I started off with washes and learning how to mix the paint. Practicing how to maneuver the paint around on the paper, because that does take a little time to learn. And of course, drawing is just another whole skill level. You know, everybody has their own skill level of drawing, but also drawing you can get better at, and practice, practice, practice. And the more you draw, the better you get at that also. Okay, so some of these sections I will let dry now. I'm going to go back up to the little pink petals and give that a little more. Things on my paper here. And you want to always try and keep your brush and your paints as clean as possible so that your colors don't get muddy. So by adding a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, I can get a little bit of a darker value, which is what I need to go the petals that are inside the other petals. This tulip is pretty closed up, but by tomorrow, I'm sure it will be open completely. Tulips have a very short lifespan, and they will be opening up as you're actually painting them sometimes. So I've got that little petal back there. And this one in here. So this one needs a little bit of, but you can see as I'm adding more layers, that the value is getting darker. And then I'm starting to put in some texture as well. And that's the way I go and build up little by little until hours and hours and hours later, the painting is complete. Any other questions? So I'm hoping you can see the individual petals. It is a little hard to see on the camera. I do want to add a little bit of this lemon yellow in here with the green because sometimes you have to hold your breath as you're making a stroke. Or at least I do, if I'm getting really close to something and I don't want to smear it. So I might go back to this stem right here and just add a few little strokes here up at the top. And you really have to examine your specimen and see how the colors do change as you're going down the stem. Some places it gets darker, and sometimes just that teeny little bit makes a huge difference. And of course, when you get inside the leaf, it's much darker. So sometimes you need to wait a while, even sometimes a day, you leave it and come back to your painting and look at it with fresh eyes and see what's missing, what do you need. Again, also leaving your painting to dry overnight sometimes is really helpful because watercolor dries much lighter than when you put it on. So when the water evaporates, you can see.
Liz, I have a question from Lori Chizazi. She said, did you wait for the pink to dry before adding the green to the bottom of the tulip flower?
Hi, Lori. So when I did my first wash, I put both colors in. So I wet the whole tulip, and I put the light wash of pink and then the light wash of green, and let the two colors kind of merge together while it was wet. So for my first wash, I did put both colors on um, at the same time. Does that answer your question, Lori? And then once I go back in, after the first wash is dry, then I come back in and start adding the little strokes of the pink and then the little strokes of the green when it is probably dry enough for me to keep going back in and adding more of each of the pigments, but I'm trying not to take away the light parts.
Hilary Boucher made a comment. She said, "Thank you so much. I have to leave the webinar, but look forward to taking classes. I have studied watercolor, but botanicals have always interested me."
Great. Okay, so are we almost done, or should I keep going?
Oh, another question from Maria Ramirez. Can I fix a mistake made with the dark color?
So that's one of the age-old questions about watercolor. It's very hard to fix. Watercolor is very hard to fix. Not to say that you can't, but you have to be very, very careful when you do it. If you feel like you have too much pigment, let's see if I can kind of demonstrate that with something.
Oh, and one other comment, just as an aside, Michelle Murphy says, "Keep going."
Oh, keep going. Okay. So let's say that this is way too dark, and I feel like it got too dark too quickly. If you use, so I have a couple of these brushes that I call my scrubby brushes. They're synthetic brushes that have kind of a stiff, small little bunch of hairs. And I'll take a tissue and make sure my brush is very clean. And I don't want it soaking wet, but wet enough to see if I can remove some of this pigment. So I'll go very slowly. And you want to kind of lift off some of that paint. So if you wet it and then blot it, you can see, I hope you can see, that some of that pigment is coming up off the paper. So you do have to kind of go over it and go over it. But do you see, Maria was the one who asked the question? You see how?
Yes, Maria.
The brush is a little stiff.
Yeah, she says she can see, yes.
Okay, and you kind of, you go very slowly until you get some of that pigment off. That's why I always say it's better to go light and then add layers that, you know, if you need to go darker, going lighter is much more difficult and much more time consuming. You can see it would take me probably a pretty long while to remove a lot of that pigment. So the other thing is, if you really need to save the white of the paper, you can use a masking fluid. So this is called drawing gum. It's the same thing. There's Winsor Newton makes a masking fluid, or Frisket. I like to use this one because it's blue, and when you put it down on your paper, you can see it pretty well. So if I had a flower with a teeny tiny stamen and I wanted to reserve that little spot, I would use this drawing gum or masking fluid. So if you put it on your paper, I use this is a very cheapy, inexpensive brush that's seen better days. You can see it's got that drawing gum on it. So I can get a very thin line if I needed to save that area without any paint on it. I would use the drawing gum, let that dry really well. You don't want to paint on top of that when it's wet because it'll ruin your whole painting. But once it's dry, then you can paint over it, and it acts like a rubber cement, not a rubber cement, yeah, like a rubber cement. It's a barrier, so you won't get any paint on that area. It'll reserve that white of the paper. And then once your painting is dry, because you also want to wait for your paint to be dry, and then you can kind of rub it off. And then you'll see that white part of the paper will be still white. So again, you could lift off to get to the white of the paper, but if watercolor kind of takes a little bit more planning ahead. That's why the drawing is so important, and the thinking about where you want your lights, where you want your white of the paper, which you can see here. I've left a little highlight. Let me turn it around here this way. If I wanted to show a little highlight on my, let's pretend it's a cherry or something. So you leave that out and paint around it. Some paints are even harder to lift to get to the white of the paper. So if a color says permanent rose or permanent green or permanent yellow, you can be assured that it is permanent. Very hard to get back to the white of the paper. Some colors lift pretty easily, but some, you know, that's why you think about a lot of these things before you go to the painting part. And also, like I said, light layers and going very slowly and building up your layers so that you're not, here we got back to the tulips, so that you're not making your paint opaque. You don't want your paint to be opaque. It's watercolor. You can see that I left like a little highlight here, little highlights here. You need to show some depth and some value shifts in your painting so that it looks three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface. I mean, that's basically what any artist is trying to do, whether it's a still life or a portrait or landscape. You're trying to show depth and you're trying to show value shifts so that you can make something appear a little more three-dimensional. Okay, Michelle, I'm going to keep going. So let's see if I can get a little more color on this leaf. Sometimes things don't look pulled together for a while, so you have to kind of push through and not give up, especially with watercolor. Sometimes you have those layers that look kind of hard edges and not so smooth, but you can put layers on top and it will sometimes fix the problem. So you can't give up and you just have to keep going. And you can see this size 2 brush, the tip is very, very, very tiny, kind of like a pencil point. All right, where shall we go from here? So some of this, I don't want to go back over until it's really dry. So I'm gonna maybe just go into these little darker areas with a little bit of dry brush. So I'm using very dry paint and my brush itself is not that wet. So the paint is going on the paper more like a colored pencil than paint. And that's what dry brush is. So I'm picking up paint that's pretty dry from my palette and making these tiny little strokes. And I will probably now wait until tomorrow to go back into any of it because I really want a lot of it to dry before I go back in. So again, any questions about anything?
We'll give it a minute or so, see if anyone has any questions.
Sure.
Anyone have any questions? Here we go. This is from Michelle Murphy to everyone. Are you with the American Watercolor Society?
I'm not with the American Watercolor Society, but I belong to the American Society of Botanical Artists, the ASBA.
And for anyone who is interested in taking Liz's classes, she teaches on Mondays. And our next session will be starting, I think, we can check the website, but I believe it's March the 7th will be the first day of the new session. So
Correct.
that would be the first day of Liz's new class. And that's from 1:30 to 4:30. So if anyone's interested, please check out our website.
And we can certainly paint tulips. Tulips, I feel like, are one of the easier flowers to paint. I'm not saying that they are easy by any means. It's still difficult to paint a flower, but the shape is a little more simplified and the leaves are a little simpler than some other flowers that have a lot more petals and a little more complex shape. So I think tulips are a good flower to start with. Plus, they're so pretty.
So, thank you very much for giving such an interesting demonstration of painting tulips. I do hope everyone enjoyed it. We hope you found it informative, and we also hope very much you'll consider taking her class. We'd also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management for their sponsorship of tonight's program. And just to let you know about upcoming events, the next lecture is also a demonstration and will be in March, given by instructor William Graff, and it's titled Boogerow Baby. So he'll be doing a demonstration of the techniques of the artist Boogerow. Please look out for our email about this lecture and other upcoming events and classes. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.